vocal group is made up of individuals.
Our next guests have already become some kind of a show business institution.
They're one of the most exciting music groups in the entire world. They have sold, believe it or not, over 50 million records.
This represents 1 million records sold. They actually have sold 2 million, and they'll get a platinum record in addition to the gold one. Ladies and gentlemen, please greet for their first visit.
Let's all stand and welcome.
And tonight I'd like you to meet each member of the Jackson Five.
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 In May of 1970, 5 brothers from Gary, Indiana made their second appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, performing their soon-to-be #1 hit. Their first appearance on the once popular variety show occurred in December of the previous year. Around the same time, they did American Bandstand. And a couple months earlier was their national television debut at the Hollywood Palace. With one electric performance after another, these siblings shot up to superstardom in a way we'd never really seen before. Almost immediately, they gained national media attention. They were featured on magazines like Life and Ebony. By the mid-70s, they even had brand endorsements. At one point in time, you couldn't turn on your TV and not see this group.
Jackson 5.
Not to mention, unforgettable performances and fan reactions only Elvis and the Beatles could rival. When you think of a young black group that caters to an R&B and pop audience, the first answer you're going to think of is the Jackson 5, because they were simply in a league of their own. Except, they weren't. In fact, many other groups, before, during, and since the Jackson 5 also fit that description. Some were even considered the Jacksons' competition for a short period of time. But none of them were able to match the success of the Jacksons or the Jackson 5. Welcome to the Soulful Rewind, where I take a closer look at your favorite oldies. Today we'll be looking at a few examples of young black singing groups. Some of these groups are considered pioneers and influenced a sound and style that lasted well into the 2000s. Other groups had great potential, but due to outside factors are either overlooked or have been forgotten altogether. While researching for this video, I found it really difficult narrowing down exactly who to talk about, since there are young black groups and artists in almost every genre. You can find them watching television. Like in 2012, 17-year-old country singer Willie Jones made his debut on America's Got Talent.
I've been thinking about this all day long. Never felt a feeling that was quite strong.
A few years later, a young rock group out of Brooklyn called Unlocking the Truth went viral. Around the same time, the Candy Masons, a family full of classical music prodigies, made their television debut on Britain's Got Talent. And as for jazz, you can find maybe the youngest prodigy in history by the name of Frank Sugarchild Robinson. However, for this video, I will be covering groups under the R&B, soul, and doo-wop genres. Before we dive into the first 3 groups, let's go over some history. While the rest of the country was focused on achieving the American dream in the 1950s, New York City had become the mecca for creativity and artistic expression. The artists that emerged at this time were known for being innovative, edgy, and pushing boundaries with their art. For musicians, there was one venue in New York that stood out to the rest: Birdland. Birdland was a jazz club, originally located on Broadway between 52nd and 53rd Street. The club was founded in 1949 by the Levy brothers, Irving and Morris. They had purchased the venue from Joseph Cataldo, a mobster famously known as Joe the Wop. They named the club Birdland after saxophonist Charlie Bird Parker. However, outside of a few performances, Parker's name was the only way he was involved at the club. Bird was already a living legend in the New York jazz scene, and the Levy brothers didn't mind profiting off of his name, knowing it would attract an audience and young upcoming musicians like John Coltrane, Art Blakey, Dizzy Gillespie, and Miles Davis. Around 1955, a man named George Goldner owned and operated multiple dance clubs in New York, along with a record label titled G Records, named after the hit song by the Crows. Due to his bad gambling habit, Goldner ended up losing 50% of his label to Morris Levy and his close associate, Joe Kolsky. The three would go on to turn G Records into Roulette Records, with Morris Levy as the chairman. They wouldn't be looking to profit off of jazz anymore. There was another movement about 10 miles north of Birdland, and it would take the world by storm. After the emergence of rock and roll in the early 50s, young people began writing love songs that were a little more relatable to their generation, and without a stage or a venue like Birdland, they created their own stage, on the street corner or under the streetlights. There wasn't a band they could rely on to provide background music, so they used their voices as the instruments and sung a cappella. While no one's really sure of the origins of the term, they called this street corner music Doo-Wop. Out of Harlem, New York, a teenage quartet called the Coupe de Villes would be the next up-and-coming doo-wop group. However, the popular groups at the time, like the Cadillacs and the Del Vikings, were quintets. And after a talent show in 1954, they added their fifth and youngest member, 12-year-old Franklin Joseph Lyman. In 1955, the Coupe de Villes, now going by the Premiers, found a stack of love poems written to a neighbor of one of the members. One of these poems would inspire members Herman Santiago and Jimmy Merchant to write a song that would change their lives. The same year, they would get noticed by record producer Richard Barrett, the former lead singer of the Valentines. Barrett had recently moved into the neighborhood where they lived and would go on to manage the Premiers, eventually getting them an audition with George Goldner at G Records. For their big audition, the group had prepared their original song, titled Why Do Birds Sing So Gay? Herman Santiago, the lead singer at the time, had developed a cold the night before and couldn't sing lead with his sore throat. In that moment, Frankie Lyman stepped forward to sing Herman's parts. And after a remarkable audition, at the request of George Goldner, Lyman remained the lead singer of the Premiers. After signing with G Records, they changed their name one last time to The Teenagers. And that original song, now titled Why Do Fools Fall in Love, was released in January of 1956.
Why do fools fall in love? Why do birds fall in love? And love is the way to pray today. Why do they fall in love?
Not only was the song the Teenagers' first hit, it reached top 10 on the Billboard pop charts and peaked at number 1 on the R&B charts. And for the year of 1956, it became an anthem for teens everywhere. This is a clip of two-time Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee Sammy Strain from the documentary Streetlight Harmonies, talking about the summer of 1956.
When Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers jumped over that wall, I think the next day, teenage groups popped up from coast to coast. They caused an epidemic. There were groups in every schoolyard. They were all over, and no matter where you went in 1956, during the summer, no matter what neighborhood, what project, you heard harmony every place you went.
One of those groups also came out of Harlem, New York, and went by the name The Schoolboys. Their biggest hit, Please Say You Want Me, peaked at 13 on the R&B charts.
Please say you want me to be your...
In 1957, 6 teenagers started a group in Cincinnati, Ohio. Roy Ford, Richard Johnson, Dorsey Porter, John Bolden, Ralph Bird, and lead singer Leroy King. All 6 members were black. Ironically, they went by the name The Detalians. In 1958, another teenager named William Tyus also known as Prez, was madly in love with a woman named Patricia Pearson, who inspired Prez to write constantly. Checker Records, a sub-label to the popular Chicago-based Chess Records, was the first to offer the D'Italians a record contract, but he wasn't satisfied with the name, since none of them were Italian. He named them the Students, to follow the trend of similar groups like the Teenagers and the Schoolboys. They were accompanied by the Jimmy Coe Big Band, featuring future jazz legend Wes Montgomery playing rhythm guitar. Their first song, I'm So Young, is known as a doo-wop classic.
We want to get married, but we're so young, so young.
The other side, Every Day of the Week, is another doo-wop classic, and possibly the group's biggest song, featured in shows like The Sopranos. The Students' second and final record, My Vow to You, released in 1959.
My vow to you is sincere, this I promise you.
In 1962, Chess Records lost faith in the group, and as a result, they were dropped from the label. The Students broke up as a group the same year. They never released a full-length album. Back to the Teenagers. Their only album, titled The Teenagers featuring Frankie Lyman, released in December of 1956. They released a total of 8 hits in 56 and 57. 6 of them reached the top 10. The Teenagers were a national success and are still recognized as the first teenage group in rock and roll. Frankie specifically was seen as a crossover artist, a singer who appealed to not only the black audience, but a white audience as well. By 1957, they were officially Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. It wouldn't be long before management looked to prioritize Frankie and get rid of the Teenagers altogether. In September of that year, Frankie Lyman went solo. Frankie's solo career was short-lived and underwhelming. After convincing Frankie to go solo, Morris Levy and Roulette Records simply had no direction for his career, with only 2 hit songs after his departure from the Teenagers. Both of them were covers. At 15 years old, Frankie became notoriously addicted to heroin. Often missing shows, recording sessions, and rehearsals, he shortly became a liability as he couldn't control his addiction. By the time he reached his 20s, Frankie Lyman was blackballed from the music industry. He'd made several attempts to get clean and come back throughout the 60s. However, his addiction would get the best of him, and in February of 1968, Frankie Lyman would die of a heroin overdose at the young age of 25. Like many black artists before and after him, Frankie Lyman died broke. A lot of this is due to the actions of Morris Levy. In the 1998 Warner Brothers film, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, it was revealed that Levy had placed his name as a songwriter for almost every hit made by Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. Similar to Birdland in the 50s, Levy tried to capitalize off the talent of the Teenagers. The actual writers of the song, Jimmy Merchant and Herman Santiago, eventually lost their case to be officially named as songwriters due to the statute of limitations running out. Young groups like the Teenagers, the Schoolboys, and the Students are often overlooked. A lot of it is due to them not reaching their full potential. Songs like Why Do Fools Fall in Love and I'm So Young have been covered throughout the years. There was also a doo-wop resurgence in the mid-2000s, headed by child sensation Kid Kyle. Still, their impact as pioneers of their genre is forgotten in music history. And as for Frankie Lyman, instead of being known as MJ before MJ, he joins a long list of young artists who've lost their lives due to their battle with drug addiction. Moving on to the 60s. The turn of the decade brought many changes in pop culture. Everything from fashion to films to music rapidly changed throughout the 60s. The legends of street corner harmonies in '56 were now relics of the past by '63. Kids that grew up on the coasters and the teenagers were now old enough to make their own music, develop their own sound. This was true for the Jacksons coming out of Gary, Indiana. But just one state over in Chicago, Illinois, another musical family emerged onto the scene. The Burke family. Aloha, Clarence Jr., James, Dennis, and Kenneth Burke were the first iteration of the family's group. However, they didn't use their last name like the Jacksons or the Osmonds. Their mother, Betty Burke, actually suggested a new name. Referring to how they looked when they lined up according to their age, she named them the Five Stairsteps. Their musical abilities were likely passed on by their father, Clarence Sr., who accompanied his kids on the bass, as well as co-writing some of their earliest songs. They gained traction around Chicago, performing at schools, churches, and talent shows. Most notably, they won first prize at a talent competition held at Chicago's Regal Theater. During that show, they caught the attention of a musician named Fred Cash. Fred Cash was the member of a Chicago-based R&B group, The Impressions, and he introduced the Stairsteps to the group's lead singer at the time, Curtis Mayfield. Mayfield would go on to sign the Five Stairsteps to his Windy C label in the mid-'60s. For their first single, You Waited Too Long, they worked with songwriter Gregory K. Fowler.
And that's why my heart continued to burn. But you waited too long.
Fowler co-wrote the song with a now 16-year-old Clarence Jr., who also led the song. Fowler and Clarence Jr. would work together on a number of different songs, including one of the group's bigger hits, World of Fantasy, which peaked at number 12 on the R&B charts.
It's a world of fantasy.
The group's first album, self-titled The Five Stairsteps, released in 1967 and was fully produced by Curtis Mayfield. Their debut album was a great success, with 4 singles charting top 20 on the R&B charts, and they were rightfully deemed the first family of soul. For their second album, Our Family Portrait, they'd have to change their name to adjust for their youngest sibling joining the group. From then on, they officially went by The Five Stairsteps and QB. By 1970, The Five Stairsteps had made a name for themselves in R&B. However, they still didn't have that breakout #1 hit. At the time, Curtis Mayfield had too much on his plate. Balancing running his own label, as well as producing for other artists, and recording his debut solo album, Mayfield took a step back from the Stairsteps and delegated to different writers and producers. For their 1970 album, Stairsteps, Clarence Jr. decided to pay homage to the recently disbanded Beatles by covering 2 of their famous tracks. The first song was a cover of the upbeat tune Getting Better, featured on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. Their second cover was Dear Prudence, originally featured on the White Album. Wanting to release Dear Prudence as the group's first single, Mayfield hired writer and producer Stan Vincent. Starting as a child entertainer in Chicago, similar to the Stairsteps, Stan Vincent was a former child actor on the children's educational series Watch Mr. Wizard. After his acting debut, he grew up in the music industry, working and singing with doo-wop groups like the Del Satins. However, Vincent made a name for himself as a songwriter, producer, and arranger. Vincent was hired to produce the first single off the Stairsteps' new album. He was also hired to write the B-side of that record. Funny enough, that B-side would go on to be the group's biggest hit.
Ooh, child, things are gonna be easier. Ooh, child, things will be brighter. Ooh, child, things are gonna be easier. Ooh, child, things will be brighter.
In the summer of 1970, the song Ooh Child peaked at number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts, as well as 14 on the Soul charts. Their album Stairsteps became certified gold in just 3 months. More recently, Rolling Stone magazine considered Ooh Child to be one of the 500 greatest songs ever made. With the song's positive message, it joined a movement that R&B and soul had seen in the 1970s, where the primary message was to uplift and unite the black community. Around the same time, albums like What's Going On, Pieces of a Man, or Inner Visions would do the exact same thing. And in 1970, the 5 Stairsteps elevated to superstars. While I'd like to say that the Stairsteps were the only talk of the summer in 1970, I can't. Because that very same summer is when the Jackson 5 released The Love You Save, and it really kickstarted everything I was talking about in the beginning of this video. Similar to New York in the 50s, Chicago was a hotspot for young and up-and-coming artists. The 5 Stairsteps weren't the only Chicago group to make it big around this time. Groups like the Emotions and the Love Lights were also making hits. But in 1971, a young trio formed in high school would go on to be the next big thing on the Chicago music scene. And for a brief second, they tore up the charts faster than the Stairsteps. Then they disappeared. The original trio, Larry Washington, Randolph Murph, and Ralph Eskridge, were 17 and 18-year-old students at Calumet High School. Similar to the Stairsteps, they would make their name around the city performing in talent shows. Eventually, they caught the attention of a local talent manager, Anna Preston. At the time, Preston was training a 12-year-old singer by the name of Daryl Lamont, and it was Preston's idea to put Lamont in the group, officially making them a quartet. Preston named this quartet Brighter Side of Darkness. She thought Lamont's young look and voice could help them compete with other young groups like the Stairsteps and the Jacksons, who were already selling millions of records. Preston connected with songwriter and producer Clarence Johnson and urged him to make some demos with the group. Johnson had made a name for himself, writing and producing for other groups, like the Chicago-based Love Lights, with their big hit song, How Can I Tell My Mom and Dad? Johnson got his start singing with the group the Chanteurs. However, he left to pursue a songwriting and producing career. The Chanteurs would eventually go on to be the Chi-Lites. Johnson recorded the demos and shopped them around at different labels, eventually reaching out to an old friend, Russ Regan, who was an executive for 20th Century Fox's music label. Regan wasn't impressed with most of the demos, but there was one that caught his attention, and it was enough to land the group a record deal. They released that demo as the first single. And the group's first national performance was on Soul Train in January in 1973, and they performed their newest single, titled Love Jones. Love Jones raced up the charts, officially putting Brighter Side of Darkness on the map. It peaked at 16 on the Hot 100 charts, and at number 3 on the soul charts. Their Love Jones album released sometime in 1973, and featured other signature songs like I Owe You Love and I'm a Loser. I'm sure most of you have heard the song Love Jones, but you're probably wondering, why haven't I heard more from this group? Unfortunately, Brighter Side of Darkness didn't stay together that long. While there aren't any specific details available online, apparently there was an incident during the Soul Train performance in January of '73. The original 3 members, Randolph Murph, Ralph Eskridge, and Larry Washington, were caught doing something inappropriate on the way to Los Angeles. So inappropriate that it was the label's decision to fire them shortly after, only leaving a 12-year-old Daryl Lamont. Fox tried to rework the group around Daryl Lamont, and they released the song Because I Love You in 1974 with 3 new members. However, the song didn't perform too well. And soon after, Daryl Lamont left the group as well. A hit song on the radio and a gold record, the original group lasted a total of 2 months after their first single was released. The song Love Jones has since been featured on the soundtrack of the 1997 film Love Jones. Today, they're known as one-hit wonders. They weren't the Stairsteps, nor the Jacksons, but the truth is, we'll truly never know how big they could have been. For our next group, we're going to return to the 1960s and take a trip to Southern California. Not only will we find a successful family group, but at one point in time, critics were having a real conversation of who's better between them and the Jacksons.
With feathers of blue is waiting for you, right back in your own backyard.
Starting as children as young as 3 years old, Olympia, Leon III, Charmaine, and James Silvers were making a name for themselves as a group called the Little Angels. They were managed and produced by their father, Leon Silvers II. In the early 60s, the Little Angels had multiple TV appearances, and they even opened for big acts like Ray Charles. However, the little success that they saw as a group didn't change the friction that was going on between their parents. Leon Silvers II and Shirley Silvers had gotten a divorce in the mid-60s. This led to their father leaving the picture. Not only did they lose their dad, but they lost their manager. And by the late 60s, the Little Angels were no more. There is a total of 10 children in the family. And after the divorce, they were all Shirley's responsibility. Living in Watts, California, music seemed like the only right way out for their oldest brother, Leon III. And at 15 years old, Leon not only became the father figure to his younger siblings, but he was also determined to get the family group back together. This new group consisted of the 4 original Little Angels, plus their 2 younger siblings, Edmund and Ricky Silver. Similar to Clarence Jr. of the Stairsteps, Leon was the writer and producer of the group, and they officially changed the band name to the Silvers. They performed in local venues and talent shows around LA and Watts. They did well enough to get an audition for the MGM label. For their audition, Leon played his original song, Fool's Paradise, and MGM quickly signed the Silvers and released the song as the group's first single. In 1972, it peaked at 14 on the R&B charts. It even cracked the Billboard Top 100. The group's first album, self-titled The Silvers, saw moderate success. And while Curtis Mayfield was producing for the Stairsteps, Jerry Butler, co-founder of The Impressions, produced the Silvers' first album. The group's next 2 albums, The Silvers 2 and The Silvers 3, didn't perform as well as their first one. MGM would decide to drop the group after 3 years. In 1975, the group moved to Capitol Records. Leon Silvers III made a name for himself as a multi-talented writer, producer, and singer. However, he wasn't the only multi-talented Silver. Edmund Silver, one of the younger members of the group, also took up voice acting. In fact, he played Marlon Jackson on the Jackson 5 cartoon. Leon tried to make music that featured his younger siblings as lead vocalists. He wrote a song specifically for Edmund when he was younger. However, as he got older, his voice got deeper, and that particular song didn't work with Edmund's voice. So instead, he gave the song to his 11-year-old brother, Foster, who wasn't a part of the group at the time. To keep it a family act, the 2 youngest sisters, Angie and Pat, sang backup for their little brother on the record. And in 1973, the Foster Silvers hit, Misdemeanor, was released. Despite the success of his older siblings, Foster had reached new heights. The record peaked at 22 on the Hot 100 charts and reached 7 on the R&B charts, even outperforming his brother's Fool's Paradise. Following the success of Misdemeanor, it was only right that Angie, Pat, and Foster joined the family group, which officially brought them up to 9 members. And even though he missed out on Misdemeanor, Leon had one more hit up his sleeve for his younger brother to lead. The song Boogie Fever dominated the airwaves in 1975 and 1976, peaking at #1 on both the R&B charts and the Hot 100 charts. It was the Silvers' first certified gold hit. The following year, they released their Something Special album, which featured their second gold hit, Hotline. Around this time are when comparisons began to rise between the Jacksons and the Silvers. The critics were arguing who was the better group, often comparing Foster to Michael. While the Jacksons were more electrifying in concert and performances, some people preferred the Silvers for their complex harmonies you can hear on most of their records. Following the success of the Showcase album, personal tragedies began to affect the family group, beginning with the brutal assault of their oldest sister, Olympia. She had been kidnapped and sexually assaulted by 3 men in California. Fortunately, she escaped with her life. However, the impact of the event would affect her mental health, and she would go on to leave the Silvers shortly after the Showcase album. Their other sister, Charmaine, also left after getting married and becoming pregnant. In 1978, frictions between the label and Leon III were reaching its peak. The manager of the group, Al Ross, and Capitol Records wanted the group to do more pop and disco hits like Boogie Fever and Hotline. They were also looking to shift the focus around Foster Silver as a lead singer, hoping he could take the torch from Michael Jackson, who was 20 at this time. Leon wanted the group to maintain their R&B and soul roots, which you hear on tracks like Forever Yours and New Horizons. Capitol Records saw Leon Silvers as a problem, and they did their best to pit the younger siblings against their oldest brother. And in '78, after a family vote, Leon Silvers, who founded the group, was voted out. Leon will go on to find success as a writer and a producer, writing hits for groups like Shalimar and The Whispers. Just like my love. The Silvers, on the other hand, failed to make another hit without their oldest brother. And after their final album flopped, the group broke up. Around the same time, the Silvers took their manager, Al Ross, to court for missing royalties, only to find out he'd snuck in their contract that he was entitled to 50% of the group's earnings. And since they were unable to provide certain documents to prove their claim, they had to take a settlement instead. Those conversations between the Silvers and the Jacksons didn't last very long. Some disco fans remember the Silvers, especially for their smash hit Boogie Fever. And if you're a fan of old school hip-hop, you'll recognize Foster Silver's Misdemeanor being sampled on the DOC's It's Funky Enough.
1, and in comes the 2 to the 3 and 4. Then I drop the beat I have in store.
All of these groups have something in common. They all worked their way from local groups to national stars. They all created hits that surged up the music charts. Some were childhood friends, some were family, but none of them able to reach their true potential. Went from selling millions of records to being considered a flash in the pan or one-hit wonders. In the 80s, there was a young group whose story could have ended the same way. Taken advantage of by the label, broken up by their manager, as well as dealing with internal issues within the group. And yet they all found success, with and without their group. And some would argue they were more successful apart than they were together. For the final group, we'll be returning to the East Coast. Not New York City, but to Boston, Massachusetts. Coming out of the disco era in the 1970s, everything in the 80s was flashy, electrifying, and upbeat. By 1982, every kid wanted to be the next Michael Jackson. A couple of years later, they were also influenced by the rise in hip-hop, with groups like Run DMC tearing up the charts. In Boston specifically, 5 boys coming out of the Orchard Park and Cathedral projects would incorporate all of the above into their act. Members Ronnie DeVoe, Bobby Brown, Ricky Bell, Mike Bivens, and Ralph Tresvant would perform around Boston going by the name New Edition. They were managed by local talent manager and choreographer Brooke Payne, the uncle of Ronnie DeVoe. Their big break would occur at a 1981 talent show held at the Strand Theater, where they won an opportunity to record a demo with local record producer and former artist Maurice Starr. While I believe it's up for debate, I think most people would agree New Edition was in reference to being the next Jackson 5. Of course, it's impossible to ignore the Jacksons' influence on this group. However, I don't think that's what Brooke Payne had in mind. If you look at a number of features, specifically their choreography and their ability to switch off between 3 lead singers, I've always considered them to be the new addition to more traditional vocal groups, like the Temptations. It was actually Maurice Starr who leaned into the Jackson comparison. According to court documents from their 1986 lawsuit against Streetwise, Starr's vision for the group was to essentially recreate the Jackson 5. For example, there were only 4 members in New Edition when they performed at the talent show in the Strand Theater. Ralph Tresvant, Bobby Brown, Ricky Bell, and Michael Bivins were the first original members. It was Starr's idea to add a 5th member. Brooke Payne chose his nephew Ronnie DeVoe. While hindsight will tell you that was the right decision, some of Maurice Starr's other requests could have derailed New Edition's career before it even started. Apparently, Maurice Starr wanted to change the group's appearance, telling them they need to grow out their afros to appear more like the Jacksons. He also wanted to change the name of the group, claiming they should go by the Magic 5. It was also Starr's decision to prioritize Ralph Tresvant as the full-time lead singer of the group, essentially saying he's Michael and the rest were just the Jacksons. While that decision didn't affect the early success of New Edition, it would go on to affect the relationship between Tresvant and other members down the line. Despite all the demands the Starr had for the young group, they were able to record their demo, keep their natural hair, and keep their original name. That demo will go on to be the group's first hit, titled Candy Girl, released in 1982. The song went number 1 on the R&B charts, famously dethroning Michael Jackson's Beat It. Their debut album, also titled Candy Girl, was released in the summer of 1983. And with singles like This Is the End and Popcorn Love doing fairly well in the R&B charts, the preteen group was well on their way. Candy Girl was a smash hit. Whether it would have gone gold or platinum is up for debate, because possibly the group's biggest hit wasn't RIAA certified. Apparently, Maurice Starr's distribution label Streetwise was penalized by the organization for questionable accounting practices. This, and the group receiving a lack of royalties from their hit single, album, and tour, led to New Edition suing Maurice Starr, leaving his label, and signing to MCA Records in 1984. Or so they thought. Their sophomore album, self-titled New Edition, would only add to the group's image as rising stars. With hits like Lost in Love, Mr. Telephone Man, and their biggest hit, Cool It Now, all reaching top 10 on the R&B charts, and Cool It Now reaching a top 5 on the Hot 100. From a fan's perspective, everything seemed right in the world of New Edition. But the internal problems the group was dealing with would lead to major changes, not only in the group's sound, but their members as well. During the legal battle with Maurice Starr and Streetwise, New Edition hired the Machat brothers, Stephen and Martin, to represent them in the lawsuit. And after getting them out of their contract, the group hired the Machats full-time to negotiate their next record deal. It was the Machats who negotiated their deal with MCA. However, instead of signing the group straight to MCA, the Machats created a production company called Jump and Shoot Productions and had New Edition signed to that company. Jump and Shoot Productions signed to MCA as an affiliate label. This didn't come to the group's attention right away. Only after the New Edition album released in 1984 did they recognize Jump and Shoot Productions on the back of the album. Apparently, it would cost the group $500,000, $100,000 from each member, to get out of this contract. And for the next 2 albums, Jump and Shoot would have creative control over everything New Edition. The members had little to no influence over their sound or their image. Sometime in 1985, it became apparent that Bobby Brown, the founder of New Edition, had become increasingly frustrated with his role in the group. He believed that he should lead more songs, and also felt that the label was treating the rest of New Edition as backup dancers. While the rest of the group quietly shared his opinion, it was Brown who would openly act out and rebel. He would do so by missing rehearsals and shows, and openly using drugs and alcohol. And for the times that Brown would perform, he would go rogue, singing his two biggest songs, Mr. Telephone Man and Jealous Girl, sometimes dragging out the songs for up to an extra 5 minutes. Sometime in '85, MCA and Jump and Shoot became fed up with Brown's antics. And similar to Leon Silvers and his siblings, Bobby Brown was voted out of New Edition. Even though Brown is on the cover for their 1986 album All for Love, it was their Christmas album, titled Christmas All Over the World, released in 1985, that was the last album that featured Bobby Brown's vocals. All for Love only produced one hit, titled Count Me Out, which did reach number 2 on the R&B charts. As the group got older, they were searching for a more mature sound. However, the album continued to portray New Edition as the bubblegum pop group that they started out as. Also in '86, they joined the soundtrack for the film The Karate Kid Part 2. They were asked to cover the Doo-Wop classic, Earth Angel, originally done by the Penguins. To the group's disbelief, the song did pretty well. And instead of making a more mature-sounding album for the group, Jump and Shoot Productions decided to spin the success of Earth Angel into a whole throwback doo-wop album, titled Under the Blue Moon. The group would cover doo-wop classics, notably the songs Duke of Earl, 1,000 Miles Away, and Tears on My Pillow, featuring the vocals of doo-wop legend Little Anthony. While all of this is happening, Ralph Tresvant wanted to go solo, similar to his ex-bandmate Bobby Brown, who had just released his first solo album. Their deal with Jump and Shoot Productions ended in 1986. Tensions were rising between Tresvant and the remaining 3 members, Bell, Bivens, and DeVoe. Their next move could have been to break up and have everyone go their separate ways in the music industry. That could have been the end of New Edition right there. But it wasn't. Ralph did plan to go solo in '86, and he was already recording demos for his breakout album, Living in a Dream. But the other members of New Edition planned to focus their energy on the next album, the more mature-sounding album that they always wanted. An album that showcases the group's transition from boys into men. Michael Bivens even took the extra step in recruiting a 5th member, Johnny Gill, to help with the group's more mature sound. MCA fully backed the next New Edition album after they officially signed to the label in 1986. The album, titled Heartbreak, was released in June of 1988.
Be right there for me.
Songs like Can You Stand the Rain, You're Not My Kind of Girl, and If It Isn't Love dominated the R&B charts in the summer of '88. The Heartbreak album was a huge success and ended up going double platinum, which made it their most successful album up to that time. While the group was at an all-time high, the good times were officially behind them. Ralph still had every intention of going solo. Johnny Gill had a solo album on the horizon. And Bobby Brown had reached new heights of superstardom in 1988, dropping his classic Don't Be Cruel album on the same date Heartbreak dropped.
They say I'm crazy. I really don't care. That's my prerogative. They say I'm nasty.
Don't Be Cruel famously outperformed his ex-band, peaking at number 1 on the top 200 albums, and while they both reached double platinum status by the end of '88, as of 1995, Don't Be Cruel has gone 7 times platinum. The Living in a Dream album ended up being a fantasy. Tresvant openly blames MCA for shelving his album, and states that the sound and image that he had for Living in a Dream was given to Bobby for Don't Be Cruel. His self-titled debut album, Ralph Tresvant, released in '91, and did extremely well.
Girl, I know it's been hard since you went away and left you so sad. Would you cry every day?
The album quickly went gold after its release, and eventually became platinum. Johnny Gill's self-titled album, released in 1990, and saw a lot of success as well.
Put on your red dress and slip on your high heels and some of that sweet perfume. It sure smells good on you.
Songs like Rub You the Right Way and My were both number one on the R&B charts. Bobby Brown, Ralph Tresvant, and Johnny Gill were known as the lead singers of the group. And Ralph and Johnny obviously benefited from the release of Heartbreak. However, it's possible the remaining three members, Ricky Bell, Michael Bivins, and Ronnie DeVoe, benefited the most. With all the other New Edition members pursuing solo careers, famous producers Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis encouraged the remaining three to stick together and form a trio. And in 1989, they formed Bell Biv DeVoe.
It's driving me out of my mind. That's why it's hard for me to find. Can't get it out of my head. Miss her, kiss her, love her. That girl is...
Their first single, titled Poison, peaked at number 3 on the Hot 100 charts. This song will go on to be an anthem for the decade of the 90s, and the growing subgenre fusing hip-hop with R&B called New Jack Swing. Their debut album, also titled Poison, will go on to sell 4 million records, and peaked at number 5 on Billboard's Top 200 albums, outperforming everyone else's solo project except Bobby Brown. All 6 members would unite for their 6th and highest-selling album, Home Again, in 1996. Today, they're recognized as an R&B supergroup, known for their countless hits and their unforgettable choreography. The world fell in love with New Edition all over again in 2017 after the release of the BET original miniseries, The New Edition Story. Their influence transcended 80s pop and 90s New Jack Swing. Young groups in the 2000s like B2K were heavily influenced by New Edition and were often compared to them. While the Jacksons weren't the only young black group in the music industry, they set themselves apart by being able to last throughout the years. Similar to groups like New Edition, the Jacksons left their first label as well. Similar to the Silvers, they also had the internal issues that stem from being a family group. And similar to the Teenagers, they saw their lead singer go solo. Yet they stayed together long enough to be regarded as one of the greatest young groups of all time. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was the Motown machine. Maybe it was just Michael. Either way, it's evident throughout history that young black groups have the cards stacked against them from the start, making it almost impossible for them to break through, let alone last in the industry. Maybe that's why we don't see them as much anymore. That's why what the Jacksons accomplished was so impressive. They were the exception. They beat the odds.